The October air bit sharp and clean as four men loaded their gear into the back of Marcus Webb's weathered Ford F-250. 23 years, they'd been making this pilgrimage together, ever since they graduated high school and discovered that the bond forged in Friday night football games and weekend fishing trips could survive marriages, divorces, career changes, and the slow grind of middle age. Now, at 41, they were all different men than they'd been at 18. But when elk season opened, they became boys again. Marcus slammed the tailgate shut and wiped his hands on his jeans. At 6'2", with graying temples and hands scarred from 20 years of construction work, he was the natural leader of their group. He'd inherited the old hunting cabin from his grandfather 3 years ago, and it had become their sanctuary, their escape from the world of mortgages and marriages and all the small compromises that defined adult life. "You forget anything, Danny?" Marcus called to his younger brother, who was double-checking his rifle case for the third time. Danny had always been the anxious one, the planner, the man who packed backup batteries for his backup flashlight. At 38, he taught high school biology and coached junior varsity football, and his students would have been shocked to see him in full camouflage, a .30-06 slung across his shoulder. "I'm good," Danny said, though he was already mentally reviewing his checklist. Extra socks, water purification tablets, first aid kit, emergency flares. He'd learned long ago that preparation was the difference between a good hunt and a disaster. Kai Thompson emerged from his house carrying a canvas duffel bag that had seen better decades. Half Navajo, half Irish, Kai was the quietest of the four. A man who could read the forest like a book written in a language the others barely understood. He worked as a park ranger in the summer and a hunting guide in the fall, and there wasn't a trail within 100 miles he hadn't walked. His dark eyes held the kind of patience that came from spending more time with trees than with people. "Weather looks good through Wednesday," he said, settling into the passenger seat. "Clear skies, no wind. Should be perfect." The fourth member of their group, Tommy Reeves, was already in the back seat, scrolling through messages on his phone while he still had signal. A successful insurance salesman with a mortgage on a house too big for his needs, Tommy was the one who paid for most of their supplies and never mentioned it. He was also the loudest, the storyteller, the man who could make 4 days in the wilderness feel like a vacation instead of an ordeal. "My ex-wife's lawyer wants to schedule another meeting," Tommy said, not looking up from his phone. "I told him I'd be unreachable for the next 4 days. Ain't that right, boys?" "What happens in the deep woods stays in the deep woods," Marcus said, starting the engine. It was their motto, their sacred pact. No phones, no outside world, just 4 friends and the ancient rhythm of the hunt. The drive to the trailhead took 3 hours, winding through increasingly remote mountain roads until the pavement gave way to gravel, then to dirt. They passed the last occupied house 40 minutes before reaching the parking area, a small clearing where the road simply ended, blocked by a chain and a sign warning that the area beyond was accessible only on foot or horseback. Marcus pulled the truck as close to the chain as possible and killed the engine. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the whisper of wind through pine needles and the distant call of a crow. This was why they came. Not just for the elk, though that was part of it, but for this moment when the world suddenly became huge and wild and empty of everything except possibility. They shouldered their packs in practiced silence, each man carrying roughly 60 pounds of gear, food, and ammunition. The trail to the cabin was 8 miles of switchbacks and creek crossings. A journey that would take them deep into the kind of wilderness where cell phones became paperweights, and the nearest neighbor was measured in days, not miles. The cabin itself had been built in 1962 by Marcus's grandfather, a logger named Earl Webb, who'd purchased 40 acres of timberland and carved out a homestead that was equal parts hunting lodge and hermitage. Earl had lived there full-time for 15 years before a heart attack drove him back to civilization, but he'd maintained the place until his death, and now Marcus carried on the tradition. It was a simple structure: 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, a hand-pump well, and an outhouse that Earl had positioned with mathematical precision to take advantage of prevailing winds. Solar panels installed 5 years ago provided enough electricity to run LED lights and charge a radio. But that was the extent of modern convenience. Heat came from wood, water came from the well, and entertainment came from conversation and the kind of silence that city dwellers paid therapists large sums of money to experience. The hike took them 4 hours, following game trails that were older than the state itself. Kai led the way with the easy stride of a man who'd been walking these mountains since childhood, while Danny brought up the rear, his teacher's instincts making him the natural choice to ensure no one fell behind. Marcus and Tommy walked in the middle, their conversation ranging from football to politics to the kind of philosophy that emerged when men got far enough from civilization to remember who they'd been before the world taught them to be afraid of their own thoughts. They reached the cabin as the sun was touching the western peaks, painting the forest in shades of gold and amber. The structure sat in a small clearing beside a creek that ran clear and cold from snow melt high in the mountains. Earl had chosen the location well, sheltered from the worst winds, close to water, with clear sightlines in all directions and game trails converging like spokes on a wheel. "Home sweet home," Marcus said, dropping his pack on the porch. The cabin looked exactly as they'd left it the previous year, which was to say it looked like it had been abandoned for decades and somehow remained perfectly preserved. The logs were gray with age, but solid. The roof showed no signs of leaks, and the windows, though small, were intact. Inside, the cabin was spartanly furnished but comfortable. 2 sets of bunk beds, a table and chairs built from logs and hand tools, shelves lined with canned goods and emergency supplies. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its chimney drawing perfectly after 60 years of service. The second room held gear storage and a small kitchen area with a wood-burning stove that Earl had somehow hauled 8 miles through the wilderness in pieces. They fell into the familiar rhythm of making camp. Marcus and Kai gathering firewood, Danny organizing their food supplies, Tommy sweeping out the accumulated dust and checking the solar battery levels. Within an hour, they had a fire crackling in the fireplace, dinner heating on the wood stove, and 4 folding chairs arranged in a semicircle that had worn smooth grooves in the wooden floor. As darkness fell, they sat around the fire with bottles of beer that had been carefully rationed and carried 8 miles for this exact moment. The conversation was easy, comfortable, the kind of talk that happened between men who'd known each other long enough to skip the small talk and dive straight into the matters that actually mattered. "Sarah asked me if I was having a midlife crisis," Tommy said, peeling the label off his beer bottle. "She said grown men don't disappear into the wilderness every year unless they're running from something." "What'd you tell her?" Danny asked. "I told her I wasn't running from anything. I was running to something." Tommy gestured at the fire, the cabin, the darkness beyond the windows. "This, whatever this is," Marcus nodded. "My grandfather used to say that men need wild places the same way they need air. Take it away and something inside starts to die." "The Navajo have a word for it," Kai said quietly. "Hoso. It means walking in balance with the world. Most people spend their whole lives looking for it in the wrong places." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the fire pop and the creek murmur in the darkness. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called, a sound that seemed to come from the forest's deep memory. This was peace, Marcus thought. This was what happiness felt like when you stripped away everything that didn't matter. "Early start tomorrow?" Danny asked, though he already knew the answer. "First light," Marcus confirmed. Kai spotted fresh sign about 2 miles north of here. "Big bull, probably a 6-point. "Maybe this is the year we actually get one," Tommy said. They'd been hunting together for more than 2 decades, and their success rate was embarrassingly low. They told themselves it didn't matter, that the hunting was just an excuse for the camping. But the truth was more complicated. They were good hunters individually. Each had taken elk on other trips with other people. But something about their group dynamic made them too social, too comfortable, too willing to prioritize conversation over patience. "This is the year," Kai said with quiet confidence. "I can feel it." They banked the fire before midnight and settled into their bunks. Marcus and Tommy on one side of the room, Kai and Danny on the other. The forest outside was alive with small sounds. The rustle of night creatures, the whisper of wind through pine needles, the distant yip of coyotes. It was a symphony that city ears would find disturbing. But for these four men, it was better than any lullaby. Marcus lay awake for a while, listening to the familiar chorus and thinking about the year that had passed since their last trip. His construction business had grown to 12 employees, but the success felt hollow somehow. He made more money than his father ever had, owned more things, commanded more respect, but lying here in a cabin with no electricity and no cell service felt more like home than the house he'd been making mortgage payments on for 8 years. Danny's breathing settled into the steady rhythm of sleep, followed by Tommy's soft snores. Kai was silent. But Marcus could tell from the way he moved that he was still awake, probably listening to the forest with the kind of attention that came from generations of ancestors who'd survived by knowing what every sound meant. "You hear anything interesting out there?" Marcus whispered. "Just the usual," Kai replied, his voice so quiet it was barely audible. "Deer moving through the oak grove, raccoons at the creek. Everything sounds right." Marcus closed his eyes and let the forest sounds wash over him. "Everything sounds right," he thought, and drifted off to sleep. Marcus woke before dawn, his internal clock calibrated by decades of early mornings. The cabin was cold and dark, the fire reduced to glowing embers, but he could see the first pale hint of light through the eastern window. He slipped out of his sleeping bag without waking the others and pulled on his boots and jacket. Outside, the forest was draped in pre-dawn silence, that magical hour when even the night creatures had settled down to sleep, but the day shift hadn't yet begun. The air was crisp and still, perfect hunting weather, and Marcus felt the familiar surge of anticipation that had been drawing him to these woods for more than 20 years. He rekindled the fire and put coffee on to brew, and by the time the rich aroma filled the cabin, the others were stirring. They moved with practiced efficiency, eating a quick breakfast of oatmeal and fruit, checking their rifles and preparing for a day that might end with fresh elk steaks or might end with nothing but sore feet and good memories. "Same plan as always?" Danny asked, shouldering his day pack. Marcus nodded. "We'll split into 2 teams. Kai and I will work the North Ridge where he saw the sign yesterday. You and Tommy take the creek bottom. We'll meet back here by 4 o'clock. It was a strategy that had never worked, but that they followed religiously, partly from superstition and partly because it gave them an excuse to cover more ground than they could manage as a single group. The truth was that elk hunting was 90% patience and 10% luck, and their odds weren't significantly better or worse, regardless of how they arranged themselves. They left the cabin as the sun was clearing the eastern peaks, walking in pairs along trails that deer had worn smooth over centuries of use. The forest was waking up around them, squirrels chattering in the pine boughs, birds calling from hidden perches, the distant drumming of a woodpecker echoing off the canyon walls. Marcus and Kai headed north along a ridge that offered commanding views of the valley below. They moved slowly, stopping frequently to glass the meadows and clearings where elk might emerge to feed. Kai had an almost supernatural ability to spot movement that other people missed, a skill that came from growing up on the reservation where hunting wasn't a hobby but a necessity. "There," Kai whispered, pointing toward a grove of aspen trees half a mile away. "Something big moving through the trees." Marcus raised his binoculars and scanned the grove until he found what Kai had seen, a flash of brown hide between the white-barked trees, too large to be a deer, moving with the deliberate pace of an animal that had no natural predators. "Bull elk," Marcus breathed. "Jesus, Kai, look at the rack on him." They watched the elk emerge into a small meadow, a magnificent animal that stood nearly 5 feet at the shoulder, with antlers that spread wider than a man's outstretched arms. He grazed peacefully for several minutes, unaware that he was being observed, before disappearing back into the trees. "Think we can get close?" Marcus asked. Kai studied the terrain, his mind automatically calculating wind direction, cover, and approach routes. "Maybe. We'd have to circle around through the timber, stay downwind. Take us an hour, maybe 2. They began the careful stalk that was the heart of hunting, moving through the forest with the kind of patience that city life had trained out of most people. Every step was deliberate, every sound considered. They communicated with hand signals and occasional whispers, their attention focused on the grove where the elk had disappeared. It took them 90 minutes to work their way into position, and by the time they had a clear shooting lane, the elk was gone. They found his tracks and his beds, fresh sign that told them they'd missed him by minutes, but the animal himself had vanished as completely as if he'd never existed. "Story of my life," Marcus said, shouldering his rifle. "Day late and $1 short." "He'll be back," Kai said with quiet confidence. "This is his territory. We just have to be patient." They spent the rest of the morning exploring the ridge, finding more elk sign than they'd seen in years. Fresh rubs on small trees, beds in the tall grass, trails worn deep by generations of animals following the same routes between feeding and bedding areas. It was encouraging and frustrating in equal measure. The elk were here, but they were ghosts. Meanwhile, Danny and Tommy were having their own adventure in the creek bottom, following game trails through dense timber where visibility was limited to a few yards in any direction. They moved more slowly than their friends on the ridge, partly because the terrain was more difficult, and partly because Danny's methodical nature made him stop to examine every track, every scat, every broken twig that might tell them something about the animals they were pursuing. "Look at this," Danny said, kneeling beside a muddy section of trail. "Wolf tracks, big ones." Tommy leaned over his shoulder, studying the prints. "You sure? Could be a big dog. Out here? 8 miles from the nearest road?" Danny shook his head. "These are wolf tracks, fresh ones too, maybe 6 hours old." The presence of wolves added a new element to their hunt. Elk behavior changed dramatically when predators were in the area, making them more skittish, more likely to move during daylight hours, more unpredictable in their patterns. It also meant that Tommy and Danny needed to be more aware of their surroundings, more alert to sounds that might indicate they weren't alone in the creek bottom. They followed the creek for 3 miles, finding plenty of elk sign but no animals. The wolf tracks appeared regularly in the mud beside the water, sometimes joined by the prints of other pack members. Danny counted at least 4 different animals, possibly more, and all of them were big, adults in their prime. "Makes sense," Tommy said when Danny shared his assessment. "Elk are prey animals. Where there's prey, there's predators." "Yeah, but wolves have been extinct in this area for 50 years. What are they doing back? Maybe they were never really gone. Maybe they just got better at hiding." They stopped for lunch at a beaver pond that had created a small wetland meadow, one of those secret places that existed in wilderness areas, but were invisible from roads or established trails. The sun was warm on their faces, the water reflected the sky like a mirror, and for a moment, both men felt the deep contentment that came from being exactly where they were supposed to be. "This is why we come," Tommy said, biting into a sandwich. "Not for the elk, for this." Danny nodded, though he was still thinking about the wolf tracks. Something about them bothered him, though he couldn't put his finger on what. The size was unusual, but not impossible. The freshness suggested a pack moving through, following the elk migration routes. But there was something else, something that his biology teacher's brain couldn't quite categorize. They rejoined Marcus and Kai at the cabin in mid-afternoon, all 4 men tired but exhilarated by a day in country that seemed to hold more wildlife than they'd seen in years. Marcus and Kai described their encounter with the big bull, while Danny and Tommy shared their discovery of the wolf sign. "Wolves?" Marcus raised his eyebrows. "You sure about that?" "Pretty sure," Danny said. "I took pictures." He pulled out his digital camera and scrolled through the images, stopping on a clear shot of a paw print in the mud. "Look at the size of that thing." Kai studied the photograph with the kind of attention he usually reserved for topographic maps. His expression grew thoughtful, then troubled. "Something wrong?" Marcus asked. "Maybe nothing," Kai said slowly. "But that track, it's not quite right." "What do you mean?" "The proportions are off. Toes too long, pad too wide. And see how deep it pressed into the mud? That's a heavy animal, heavier than a wolf should be." Tommy looked at the photograph again. "Could be a different subspecies. I read somewhere that wolves are getting bigger as they recolonize their old territories." Maybe, Kai said, but he didn't sound convinced. They spent the evening around the fire, trading stories and planning the next day's hunt. The big bull was still in the area, and they'd found fresh sign in several locations. The weather was holding clear and calm. Everything pointed toward a successful hunt, the kind of trip they'd remember for the rest of their lives. But as the night deepened and the fire burned low, Danny found himself thinking about the wolf tracks again. Something about them nagged at his scientific mind. Some detail that didn't fit the neat categories his education had provided. He was a biology teacher, for God's sake. He should be able to identify animal tracks with confidence. "Kai," he said quietly, "you ever see tracks like that before?" Kai was silent for a long moment, staring into the fire. "My grandfather used to tell stories," he said finally, "about animals that weren't quite animals, things that walked on the edge between the natural world and something else." "Come on," Tommy said. "You don't believe that stuff." "I believe that there are things in these mountains that don't fit into textbooks," Kai replied. "Things that were here long before we showed up with our rifles and our explanations for everything." Marcus stood and stretched, checking his watch. "Gentlemen, it's been a long day. Whatever made those tracks, we'll deal with it tomorrow. Right now, I need sleep." They banked the fire and settled into their bunks, but Danny lay awake for a long time, listening to the forest sounds and thinking about tracks that were too big, too deep, too wrong to fit any category he knew. Outside, the night was alive with movement. Branches creaking in the wind, leaves rustling, the splash of something crossing the creek. Normal sounds, he told himself. Just the forest being the forest. But as he finally drifted off to sleep, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching the cabin from the darkness beyond the windows. The second day dawned gray and still, the kind of weather that made experienced hunters nervous. The clear skies that Kai had predicted were gone, replaced by a solid overcast that seemed to press down on the forest like a weight. The air was thick and humid, unusual for October at this elevation, and carried a smell that none of them could quite identify. "Storm coming," Kai said, studying the western sky as they prepared for the day's hunt. "Big one, from the look of it." Marcus nodded, though something about the weather felt wrong in a way he couldn't articulate. He'd been hunting these mountains for 23 years, and he'd seen every kind of weather the region could produce. But this felt different. Less like a natural weather system, and more like something imposed from outside. "Maybe we should stick closer to the cabin today," Danny suggested. "If a storm hits, we don't want to be caught miles away." "Good idea," Tommy agreed. "We can work the area around the beaver pond. Plenty of elk sign there, and it's only a couple miles from base camp." They set out as a group, moving slowly through timber that seemed oddly quiet for a forest that had been alive with birdsong just the day before. The usual morning chorus of songbirds was absent, replaced by a stillness that felt more like silence than peace. "Where is everything?" Tommy asked, voicing what they were all thinking. Kai stopped and listened, his expression growing troubled. "Don't know, but something's got them spooked." They pressed on, but the wrongness of the morning continued to assert itself. Game trails that had been marked with fresh elk sign the day before were empty. The creek ran quieter than usual, as if even the water was holding its breath. Most unsettling of all, the wolf tracks that Danny had photographed were gone. Not covered by new sign, but simply absent, as if they'd never existed at all. "That's impossible," Danny said, kneeling beside the section of creek bank where he'd found the clearest prints. The mud was smooth, undisturbed, showing no sign that any animal had passed this way in days. "Maybe we're looking in the wrong spot," Marcus suggested, but he didn't sound convinced. They spent an hour searching the area, but the tracks had vanished completely. Danny even pulled out his GPS to confirm they were in the right location. But the coordinates matched exactly. The photographs on his camera showed clear wolf prints, but the ground itself told a different story. "This is fucked up," Tommy said bluntly. "Tracks don't just disappear." "Maybe it rained," Marcus said, though they all knew it hadn't. "Maybe," Danny agreed, but his scientific mind was struggling to process what he was seeing, or not seeing. Tracks in mud didn't simply vanish overnight, not without some kind of disturbance to explain their absence. They abandoned the search and continued toward the beaver pond, but their conversation was subdued, each man privately wrestling with questions that didn't have comfortable answers. The forest around them remained eerily quiet, as if every living creature had received a warning they hadn't heard. The beaver pond, when they reached it, was covered by a thin layer of mist that rose from the water like breath on a cold morning. Nothing unusual in that. Water often steamed when the air temperature was cooler than the surface, but the mist seemed thicker than it should be, more persistent. "Look at that," Kai said, pointing across the pond. On the far shore, barely visible through the mist, something large was moving between the trees. They raised their binoculars and tried to get a better look, but whatever it was seemed to shift and blur, never quite resolving into a recognizable shape. "Elk?" Marcus asked hopefully. "Wrong color," Kai said. "Too dark, and the movement isn't right." They watched for several minutes, but the shape remained frustratingly indistinct, sometimes seeming to walk on four legs, sometimes appearing to move upright. The mist swirled around it like a living thing, concealing as much as it revealed. "Should we try to get closer?" Tommy asked. "No," Kai said quickly, with an urgency that surprised them all. "We should head back to the cabin." "Why? It's not even noon yet." Kai pointed toward the western sky, where the overcast was darkening to a color that was almost black. "That storm's coming faster than I thought. We need to be somewhere safe when it hits." They gathered their gear and started back toward the cabin, moving at a pace that was just short of a retreat. Behind them, the mist at the beaver pond was thickening, spreading outward from the water like smoke from an invisible fire. By the time they reached the cabin, the first tendrils of fog were creeping through the trees. It came from no particular direction, seemed to have no source, but rose from the forest floor as if the earth itself were exhaling. Within minutes, visibility had dropped from miles to yards, and the fog continued to thicken. "Never seen anything like this," Marcus said, standing on the cabin porch and watching the gray wall advance toward them. "Fog doesn't usually form this fast." "Temperature inversion," Danny said, though he didn't sound convinced by his own explanation. "When warm air meets cold air under the right atmospheric conditions." His voice trailed off as the fog reached the cabin, flowing around the structure like water around a stone. The world beyond the porch disappeared, swallowed by gray nothing that seemed to press against the windows like living smoke. And with the fog came the smell. It was subtle at first, barely detectable beneath the normal sense of pine and wood smoke. But as the fog thickened, the smell grew stronger. Something organic and wrong, like meat left too long in the sun, like flowers rotting in stagnant water. "Jesus," Tommy said, covering his nose with his shirt. "What is that?" "Probably just decomposing vegetation," Danny said, though his biology teacher's nose told him this was something else entirely. "When fog forms over swampy areas, it can pick up organic compounds." "This doesn't smell like vegetation," Marcus interrupted. "This smells like something died." They retreated inside the cabin and closed the door, but the smell followed them, seeping through cracks around the windows and under the door frame. It was getting stronger, more pungent, carrying with it an undertone that made their stomachs turn and their skin crawl. "We need to seal this place up," Kai said, moving toward the windows. "Whatever's in that fog, we don't want it getting inside." They spent the next hour stuffing rags into every gap they could find, sealing the cabin as tightly as possible. The smell lessened but didn't disappear entirely, and the fog outside showed no signs of lifting. If anything, it seemed to be getting thicker, reducing visibility to zero. "How long do these things usually last?" Tommy asked, peering out a window into gray nothing. "Depends on what's causing it," Danny said. "Could be hours, could be days." "Days?" Marcus looked alarmed. "We've got food for 4 days, water for maybe 3 if we're careful." "The well's right outside," Kai pointed out. "We can get water whenever we need it." "In this," Marcus gestured toward the window. "I can't see 5 feet out there. We could get lost between here and the well." They settled in to wait, playing cards, and trying to maintain the easy camaraderie that had carried them through 23 years of hunting trips. But the fog pressed against the windows like a living thing, and the smell crept through their defenses, no matter how carefully they'd sealed the cabin. Worst of all were the sounds. It started in the early afternoon, a soft scraping against the outside walls, as if something were brushing against the logs. Then came footsteps, or what sounded like footsteps, circling the cabin in a slow, deliberate pattern. "Probably just a deer," Marcus said when Danny pointed out the sounds. "Deer don't walk like that," Kai said quietly. "Too regular, too purposeful." The footsteps continued for an hour, circling the cabin again and again, sometimes coming right up to the windows, sometimes retreating into the fog. They tried to catch a glimpse of whatever was making the sounds, but the gray wall outside revealed nothing. Then the voices started. The first one came just as the afternoon was fading into invisible evening, a woman's voice calling from somewhere in the fog. It was distant, muffled, but clearly human. "Help me," the voice cried. "Please, somebody help me." Tommy was on his feet immediately, moving toward the door. "Did you hear that? Someone's in trouble out there." Marcus caught his arm. "Wait, think about this. What would a woman be doing 8 miles from the nearest road in weather like this?" "I don't know, but we can't just ignore her." "Help me." The voice came again, closer this time. "I'm lost. I can't see anything." It was a young voice, frightened, desperate. Every instinct screamed at them to open the door, to rush out and help. But Kai was shaking his head, his face grim. "It's not right," he said quietly. "Listen to the echo. Sound doesn't carry like that in fog this thick." They stood frozen, torn between human compassion and animal instinct, while the voice continued to call for help. Sometimes it seemed to come from the north, sometimes from the south, sometimes from directly overhead, as if the speaker were floating in the air above the cabin. "Please," the voice sobbed. "I'm so scared. Won't somebody help me?" Tommy's hand was on the door handle, every fiber of his being demanding that he respond to someone in distress. But Marcus's grip on his arm was like iron, and Danny was shaking his head vigorously. "Think about it, Tommy. How did she get here? Where's her car, her camping gear? People don't just materialize in the middle of nowhere." The voice continued for another 20 minutes, sometimes pleading, sometimes crying, sometimes angry. Then it faded away, leaving behind only the oppressive silence of the fog and the lingering stench that seemed to coat the inside of their mouths. "What the hell was that?" Tommy asked, his voice shaky. "I don't know," Marcus admitted, "but Kai's right. Something about it wasn't normal." They tried to return to their card game, but concentration was impossible. The fog pressed against the windows like a living thing, and every small sound made them jump. The smell was getting stronger, despite their efforts to seal the cabin, and the air inside was becoming thick and oppressive. As darkness fell, or what passed for darkness in the gray nothing surrounding them, new sounds began to emerge from the fog. Scratching at the walls like claws on wood, wet, sliding noises that might have been something large moving through mud. And underneath it all, a sound that was barely audible but impossible to ignore. A kind of rhythmic breathing, slow and deep, as if something huge were sleeping just outside their door. "I need some air," Danny said, moving toward the door. "Don't," Kai said sharply. "Don't open that door." "Why not? I'm suffocating in here." "Because something's waiting out there, something that wants us to open that door." Danny looked at his friend as if he'd lost his mind. "Kai, you're talking like..." "Like what? Like there are things in these mountains that don't follow the rules we learned in school?" Kai's voice was quiet but intense. "My people have stories about fog like this, about things that hide in the mist and call with voices that aren't their own." "Jesus, Kai, you're scaring me," Tommy said. "Good, you should be scared. We all should be." They spent the evening huddled around the wood stove, feeding it constantly to keep the cabin warm and bright. The fog seemed to absorb their light, making the windows look like dark mirrors that reflected only their own frightened faces. Around midnight, the scratching at the walls stopped. The wet sliding sounds faded away. Even the rhythmic breathing grew quiet. For a moment, they thought whatever had been outside was gone. Then they heard their own voices. It was Danny's voice first, calling from outside the cabin. "Hey guys, I found something. Come look at this." Danny, who was sitting right there beside the fire, went pale. "That's not me," he whispered. "Danny, where are you?" Marcus's voice called from the fog. "We can't find you." Marcus stood up slowly, his face reflecting the same confusion and terror that Danny felt. I didn't say that. Help us. Tommy's voice shouted from somewhere in the gray. Something's wrong with the truck. We need help. Tommy's mouth was open, but no sound was coming out. He looked at his friends with wild eyes, trying to understand how his own voice could be calling to him from outside. This is impossible, Danny said, his scientific mind struggling to process what was happening. Voices don't just replicate themselves. Don't they? Kai asked grimly. According to who? According to textbooks written by people who never spent a night in the deep woods when something ancient was stirring? The voices outside continued calling to them, using their own words, their own inflections, their own desperate tones. Sometimes they seemed to be having conversations with each other, discussing plans that the real men inside the cabin had never made. Other times they called individually, each voice pleading for help, for rescue, for the simple human connection that would draw their friends outside into the fog. We can't listen to this, Marcus said, pressing his hands to his ears. We have to block it out. But the voices seemed to follow them even when they covered their ears, seemed to come from inside their own heads as much as from outside the cabin. They were perfect mimics, capturing not just the sound of their voices but the emotional undertones, the subtle patterns of speech that made each man unique. It's trying to separate us, Kai said. Whatever's out there, it wants to get us alone. What is it? Danny asked. What could do something like this? Kai was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he spoke, his voice was so low they had to strain to hear him. My grandfather called it Ye Nalblushi, the Navajo word for something that walks on the edge between human and animal, between the living world and the spirit world. Something that can wear shapes that aren't its own, mimic voices it has heard, draw people away from safety with promises and pleas. You're talking about skinwalkers, Danny said, the word barely a whisper. Kai nodded reluctantly. It's not supposed to be spoken of. But yes, that's what this feels like. Outside, their own voices continued calling, sometimes individually, sometimes together, weaving a chorus of deception that pulled at their hearts and minds with almost irresistible force. But now that they understood what they might be facing, the voices seemed less compelling, more obviously wrong. How do we fight something like that? Marcus asked. We don't fight it, Kai said. We survive it. We stay together. We don't go outside. We don't listen to the voices, and we pray that it loses interest and moves on. And if it doesn't? Kai didn't answer, but his silence was more frightening than any response could have been. They took turns sleeping in shifts, 2 men awake at all times, watching the windows and tending the fire. The fog never lifted, the smell never faded, and the voices never stopped completely. Sometimes they would quiet for an hour or two, giving the exhausted men hope that their ordeal was over, but they always returned, sometimes more urgent, sometimes more seductive, always perfectly mimicking the voices of the men trapped inside. Dawn brought no relief, just a slightly lighter shade of gray that confirmed the fog was still there, still impenetrable, still carrying its cargo of wrongness and decay. The second day in the fog passed like a fever dream. Time seemed to move differently in the gray nothing that surrounded them, stretching and contracting without reference to the sun they couldn't see or the clock that had stopped working sometime during the night. The hands were frozen at 3:17, and no amount of winding could make them move again. Their attempts at normal conversation felt forced and hollow. They tried playing cards, but concentration was impossible with their own voices calling to them from outside. They tried eating, but the smell that permeated everything made food taste like ash. They tried reading, but the words seemed to shift and blur on the pages, forming sentences that made no sense. This is psychological warfare, Marcus said during what they thought was the afternoon. Whatever's out there, it's trying to break us down mentally. It's working, Tommy replied, staring out the window at the unchanging gray. I keep wanting to open that door. Part of me thinks maybe it really is one of us out there, lost in the fog. It's not, Kai said firmly. Look at me, Tommy. You know it's not. But the certainty in Kai's voice couldn't completely dispel the doubt that the voices planted. They were so perfect, so exactly right, that listening to them created a kind of cognitive dissonance that made reality feel uncertain. Were they really all here in the cabin? Had one of them gone outside and gotten lost? How could they be sure that what they were experiencing was real? The smell was getting worse, seeping through their defenses with relentless persistence. It was the smell of things that should be buried, of life corrupted and twisted into something else. Danny, with his biology background, kept trying to categorize it scientifically, decomposing protein, hydrogen sulfide, organic acids, but the clinical terms felt inadequate. This wasn't just decay, this was wrongness made manifest. "We need to do something about the smell," he said, pulling his shirt up over his nose. "It's going to make us sick." "Already making me sick," Tommy muttered, looking pale and queasy. They tried burning cedar shavings in the fireplace, thinking the aromatic smoke might help, but the smell seemed to eat the smoke, neutralizing it before it could provide any relief. They tried breathing through wet cloths, but the moisture only seemed to concentrate the stench. Nothing worked. As the second evening approached, marked only by a slight darkening of the gray outside, the attacks intensified. The voices became more insistent, more desperate, more perfectly calibrated to prey on their emotions. "Marcus," it was his ex-wife's voice now, not one of theirs. "Marcus, please, I know you're in there, I need help." Marcus stood frozen, his face white with shock. "Jennifer?" he whispered. "She's not here," Danny said quickly. "Marcus, your ex-wife is not here." "Marcus, please." Jennifer's voice sobbed from the fog. "I'm hurt. I think my leg is broken. I was looking for you and I got lost and now I can't walk and I'm so scared." Every word was perfect. Jennifer's slight southern accent, her tendency to speak quickly when she was frightened, even the way she said his name with just a hint of annoyance even when she needed help. It was her voice, her exact voice, calling to him from the impossible gray. "It's not her," Marcus said, but his hand was moving toward the door. "It can't be her." "Marcus." The voice was closer now, right outside the door. "I can see the light from your cabin. I'm right here. Please just open the door." "Don't," Kai said, moving to block Marcus's path. "Whatever you think you're hearing, it's not real." "But what if it is?" Marcus asked, his voice cracking. "What if she really is out there? What if she's hurt and I'm just standing here listening to her beg for help?" "How would she know where to find us?" Danny asked gently. "How would she even know we were here?" "I don't know, but—" "Marcus, my leg is getting worse," Jennifer's voice interrupted. "I think I'm bleeding. Please, I'm begging you. Just open the door for a second." The rational part of Marcus's mind knew it was impossible. Jennifer lived in Phoenix, had no idea where their hunting cabin was located, and wouldn't have any way to reach them even if she knew. But the voice was so perfect, so exactly right, that doubt crept in like poison. "Just for a second," he said, reaching for the door handle. "Just to check." 3 pairs of hands grabbed him at once, pulling him back from the door. He struggled against them, not violently, but with the desperate strength of a man torn between logic and love. "Let me go," he pleaded. "What if it's really her?" "It's not," Kai said firmly. "Listen to me, Marcus. Whatever's out there, it's not your ex-wife. It's something that wants you to think it's her." "But how can you know for sure?" "Because she just called you by your full name." Marcus stopped struggling. "What?" "Jennifer never called you Marcus. In the 8 years I knew you two together, she never once called you anything but Mark. Not once." The truth of it hit Marcus like a physical blow. Jennifer had called him Mark from their second date until their divorce was final. She'd said Marcus sounded too formal, too distant. Even when she was angry, especially when she was angry, she'd called him Mark. Outside, the voice continued calling, but now Marcus could hear the wrongness in it, the subtle imperfection that his emotional response had masked. It was close, very close, but not quite right. "Good catch," Danny said, releasing his grip on Marcus's arm. "My grandfather taught me to listen for the mistakes," Kai said. "These things are powerful, but they're not perfect. They slip up sometimes, especially when they're trying to hurry." The false Jennifer called for another few minutes before giving up, her voice fading back into the fog. But she was soon replaced by other voices. Tommy's mother, Danny's daughter, people from their past who had no business being in the wilderness, but whose voices called to them with perfect emotional pitch. "How does it know?" Tommy asked after his mother's voice had pleaded with him for 20 minutes, begging him to come outside and help her find her medication. "How does it know about these people?" I don't know, Kai admitted. Maybe it reads our minds. Maybe it feeds on our memories. Maybe it just makes lucky guesses based on our emotional responses. The attacks continued through the night, a relentless barrage of psychological warfare that left all four men exhausted and shaken. They took turns sleeping, but real rest was impossible. Even with their eyes closed, they could hear the voices calling, pleading, demanding, and the smell kept getting worse. By the third morning, it was so thick they could taste it with every breath. Danny had started vomiting intermittently, unable to keep food down. Tommy had developed a constant headache that no amount of aspirin could touch. Even Marcus, who prided himself on his strong stomach, was looking green around the gills. "We can't take much more of this," Danny said, wiping his mouth with a rag. "The smell alone is going to kill us." "Maybe that's the point," Marcus said grimly. "Maybe it doesn't need to get us outside. Maybe it just needs to wait for us to die in here." The fog outside showed no signs of lifting. If anything, it seemed thicker than ever, pressing against the windows with almost physical weight. The voices had quieted with the dawn, but they all knew it was just a temporary respite. As soon as darkness fell again, the attacks would resume. "There has to be something we can do," Tommy said. "Some way to fight back." Kai shook his head. "You don't fight something like this. You endure it. You outlast it. You hope it gets bored and moves on. And if it doesn't, then we pray for a quick death." The blunt honesty of the statement hit them all like a slap. They'd been trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy, to pretend this was just an unusual weather event that would pass in time. But Kai's words stripped away the comfortable illusions and left them facing the truth. They were trapped, possibly dying, at the mercy of something that existed outside the boundaries of the rational world. "I want to try something," Danny said suddenly. "What kind of something?" Marcus asked warily. "I want to open a window, just for a second, just to get a sample of whatever's in that fog." "Are you insane?" Tommy stared at his friend in disbelief. "You want to let more of that smell inside?" "I want to understand what we're dealing with. Maybe if I can identify the chemical compounds, I can figure out what's causing this." "Danny, this isn't a science experiment," Marcus said. "This is survival." "Science is survival," Danny replied. "Understanding your enemy is the first step to defeating it." Kai considered this for a moment. "What would you need?" "Just a small sample. I've got a specimen container in my pack. If I could get some of the fog, maybe analyze it somehow." "With what?" "We don't have a chemistry lab. I've got some basic field test kits, pH strips, chemical reagents. It's not much, but it might tell us something." The idea was terrifying, but it was also the first proactive suggestion any of them had made. For 2 days, they'd been purely reactive, responding to attacks, enduring assaults, waiting helplessly for whatever was out there to make the next move. The thought of actually doing something, even something risky, was almost irresistible. "How would we do it?" Marcus asked. "Crack one of the windows, just an inch. I'll hold the container outside for a few seconds, then seal it immediately. The whole thing would take less than 30 seconds. 30 seconds is a long time when something's waiting to get inside," Kai pointed out. "But it might be worth the risk, if we can understand what we're dealing with." They debated the idea for an hour, weighing the potential benefits against the obvious dangers. Finally, they agreed to try it, but with modifications. They would open the smallest window, the one in the back room that was farthest from the main living area. They would do it during daylight hours, when the voices were quiet, and they would all be ready to slam the window shut at the first sign of trouble. Danny prepared his specimen container, a small glass vial with a tight-fitting lid, and positioned himself at the window. Marcus and Tommy stood ready to help him, while Kai watched the other windows for any sign of movement in the fog. "Ready?" Danny asked. They nodded. Danny unlocked the window and pushed it up just an inch. Immediately, the smell flooded in, so concentrated it made them all gag. But along with the stench came something else, a sound like whispers, just at the edge of hearing, and a sensation of presence, as if something were pressing against the opening from outside. Danny forced himself to hold the vial outside for 5 seconds, 10, 15. The fog seemed to reach for it with tendrils that moved independently of any wind. At 20 seconds, something brushed against his hand, something that felt like wet leather or diseased skin. He jerked the vial back inside and slammed the window shut, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. But he had his sample. The vial was full of gray mist that seemed to move and swirl even in the confined space. "Got it?" he gasped, screwing the lid tight. They retreated to the main room and sealed the door behind them. But the smell that had entered through the brief opening lingered, making the already oppressive atmosphere even worse. Danny set up his makeshift laboratory on the kitchen table, laying out pH strips, chemical reagents, and a small magnifying glass. The fog in the vial continued to move, but now that it was trapped, they could observe it more closely. "It's not behaving like normal fog," Danny said, studying the sample through the magnifying glass. "Look at this. It's moving against gravity, swirling in patterns that don't match any air currents." He dipped a pH strip into the vial. It came out black. "That's impossible," he muttered, trying again with the same result. "pH strips don't turn black. They can't. There's no pH level that produces that color." He tried other tests, chemical reagents that should have changed color in the presence of various compounds. But every test produced the same result. The chemicals didn't react at all, as if the fog weren't made of matter in any sense they understood. "It's not registering as anything," Danny said, his voice shaking slightly. "It's not acidic or basic, not organic or inorganic. It's like it doesn't exist on any spectrum I can measure." "But we can see it," Marcus pointed out. "We can smell it." "I know, but according to these tests, it's not really there." They stared at the vial in silence, watching the impossible fog swirl and dance inside its glass prison. Whatever they were dealing with, it existed outside the boundaries of chemistry, physics, and biology. It was something that science couldn't explain and instruments couldn't measure. "Put it away," Kai said quietly. "Some things aren't meant to be studied." Danny sealed the vial in his pack, but the questions it raised continued to torment him. How could something be visible but unmeasurable? How could it have smell and substance but no chemical signature? His rational mind struggled to process the contradictions, while a deeper part of him, the part that still believed in monsters under the bed, whispered that some mysteries were better left unsolved. As the third evening approached, they prepared themselves for another night of psychological torture. But something had changed. The fog outside seemed denser, more aggressive, pressing against the windows with increased force. The smell was so strong now that they'd given up trying to eat, surviving on water and will alone. And for the first time since the fog had arrived, they could see shapes moving in it. Not clear shapes, nothing that could be definitely identified, but definitely movement, definitely intent. Things that might have been human in the darkness beyond the windows, things that pressed their faces against the glass and left smears that looked disturbingly like handprints. "They're getting bolder," Marcus observed, watching a shadow pass by the front window for the third time in 5 minutes. "Or more desperate," Kai replied. "Maybe whatever's out there is running out of time." "Time for what?" "I don't know, but this level of activity, it feels like something's building to a climax." As if summoned by his words, the voices began again. But now they weren't coming from outside. They were coming from inside the cabin. "Help me," whispered a voice that sounded like Danny, though Danny's mouth wasn't moving. "I'm trapped in the walls." They spun around, trying to locate the source of the sound, but it seemed to come from everywhere at once. The walls, the ceiling, the floor beneath their feet. "Let me out," Marcus's voice pleaded from somewhere inside the cabin's structure. "I can't breathe in here." "This is impossible," Tommy said. But even as he spoke, they could hear Tommy's voice echoing his words from somewhere else in the room, creating a disturbing stereo effect. "It's inside," Kai said grimly. "Whatever it is, it's found a way inside." The voices multiplied, layering over each other until the cabin was filled with a cacophony of pleas and whispers and cries for help. Their own voices, their families' voices, the voices of people they'd known and loved and lost. All of them calling from inside the walls, begging to be released, promising safety if they would just come outside. "Cover your ears," Marcus shouted over the noise. "Don't listen to it." But the voices seemed to come from inside their heads as much as from outside. bypassing their ears entirely and speaking directly to their minds. Danny found himself walking toward the door without consciously deciding to move. Tommy was right behind him, his face blank with confusion and compulsion. Kai tackled them both, bringing them down in a heap beside the fireplace. "Fight it!" he yelled. "Whatever you think you're hearing, fight it!" "But they need help," Danny said, his voice dreamy and distant. "They're trapped, and we're the only ones who can save them." "They're not real," Kai insisted. "None of this is real." "How can you be sure?" Tommy asked. "How can any of us be sure what's real anymore?" It was a good question, and Kai didn't have a good answer. After 3 days in the fog, reality had become fluid, negotiable, subject to revision without notice. The only solid truth was the four of them, together in this cabin, but even that was beginning to feel uncertain. The voices continued through the night, sometimes soft and seductive, sometimes loud and demanding. They promised safety, rescue, reunion with loved ones. They threatened abandonment, death, eternal isolation. They played every emotional note with the skill of virtuoso musicians, conducting a symphony of psychological manipulation that left all four men exhausted and shaking. But they endured it. They held on to each other, literally and figuratively, reminding themselves who they were and where they were and why they needed to stay together. When one of them began to succumb to the voices, the others would pull him back. When despair threatened to overwhelm them, they would share memories of better times, of the friendship that had sustained them for more than 2 decades. And somehow, they made it to dawn. The third morning brought a change so subtle that at first they weren't sure it was real. The fog outside seemed fractionally lighter, the oppressive weight that had pressed down on them for 3 days marginally less crushing. The smell, while still nauseating, no longer seemed to coat their throats with every breath. "Is it lifting?" Tommy asked hopefully, peering out the front window. "Maybe," Marcus replied, though he was afraid to voice too much optimism. They'd been disappointed before, moments when the fog seemed to thin, only to return thicker than ever. But as the morning progressed, the change became undeniable. Visibility increased from a few feet to several yards, then to almost 20 feet in some directions. They could see trees again, vague shadows that suggested the world beyond their prison still existed. "I can see the well," Danny said, pressing his face to the kitchen window. "It's still there." The relief in his voice was palpable. After 3 days of gray nothing, the simple sight of a familiar landmark was almost overwhelming. The well represented normalcy, rationality, the world they remembered from before the fog. "Think it's safe to go outside?" Marcus asked. Kai studied the thinning mist with the careful attention of a man who'd learned not to trust easy answers. "Not yet, but maybe soon." They spent the morning watching and waiting, afraid to hope, but unable to stop themselves from imagining escape. The fog continued to thin gradually, revealing more of their surroundings with each passing hour. By noon, they could see almost 50 feet in every direction. Still not far, but a vast improvement over the complete blindness they'd endured. "I'm going to try for the truck," Marcus announced suddenly. "Are you crazy?" Tommy stared at him. "We don't know if it's really over." "Look around, Tommy. The fog's lifting. Whatever was out there, it's gone. Or it's just waiting for us to come outside." "Maybe. But we can't stay in here forever. We're almost out of food, the smell is making us sick, and if we don't leave soon, we might not have the strength to make the hike out." It was true. 3 days of minimal eating and constant stress had left them all weakened. Danny had lost at least 10 pounds, his clothes hanging loose on his frame. Tommy's hands shook constantly, whether from hunger or psychological trauma. Even Marcus, the strongest of the four, moved with the careful deliberation of an old man. "I'll go with you," Kai said. "No. If something happens to me, you three still have a chance. If we both go and something goes wrong—" "Nothing's going to go wrong," Kai said firmly. "The fog is lifting. Whatever was out there, it's moving on." They argued about it for another hour, but eventually agreed that 2 men should make the attempt while 2 stayed behind. If Marcus and Kai could reach the truck and get it started, they would drive back to the cabin and pick up the other 2. If something went wrong, Danny and Tommy would have to decide whether to wait or attempt the 8-mile hike to civilization. Marcus and Kai prepared for the expedition like soldiers going into battle. They checked their rifles, packed emergency supplies, and agreed on signals they would use to communicate across the distance. If everything went well, they would be back within an hour. If not, "Don't wait more than 3 hours," Marcus told Danny and Tommy. "If we're not back by then, assume something went wrong and get out however you can." "We'll wait," Danny said. "No. Promise me you won't wait longer than 3 hours. Promise me you'll try to save yourselves." Reluctantly, they agreed. Marcus and Kai stepped out onto the cabin porch, and for the first time in 3 days, they could see the sky. It was overcast but real, no longer the uniform gray ceiling that had pressed down on them like the lid of a coffin. The air was still thick with mist, but it was recognizably fog now. Natural fog, the kind that formed over lakes and rivers on cool mornings. "Feels different," Kai said, taking a deep breath. Marcus nodded. The oppressive wrongness that had characterized the past 3 days was gone, replaced by something that felt like ordinary weather. The smell still lingered, but it was fading, becoming more like the scent of autumn leaves and less like decay. They began walking toward where they remembered the truck being parked, moving slowly and carefully through the thinning mist. Visibility was still limited, but they could see well enough to navigate. Well enough to spot trouble if it appeared. The forest around them was eerily quiet. No birds, no insects, no small animals moving through the underbrush. It was as if the fog had killed everything or driven it away, leaving behind a world that was clean but empty. "There," Kai said, pointing ahead. The truck materialized out of the mist like a ship emerging from harbor fog. It looked exactly as they'd left it 3 days ago, dusty, practical, reassuringly normal. Marcus felt a surge of emotion at the sight of it, as if he were seeing an old friend after a long absence. He climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key. Nothing. He tried again, pumping the gas pedal and adjusting the choke, but the engine didn't even turn over. The battery was dead, completely drained, as if something had been running all night for 3 nights straight. "Shit," he muttered, popping the hood. Kai joined him in staring at the engine, but neither of them was a mechanic. The battery terminals were clean, the connections tight, the belts and hoses intact. By all appearances, the truck should have started without trouble. "Maybe the cold drained it," Marcus suggested, though he knew that didn't make sense. It hadn't been that cold, and the battery was less than a year old. "Or maybe something doesn't want us to leave," Kai said quietly. They tried jumping the battery with a portable jump starter that Marcus kept in his emergency kit, but even that didn't help. The engine remained completely dead, as if some vital spark had been drained from it during the 3 days of fog. "We'll have to walk," Marcus said finally. 8 miles through this fog? In our condition? You got a better idea?" Kai didn't answer, but they both knew the alternatives were limited. They could return to the cabin and wait for the fog to lift completely, but there was no guarantee it would. They could try to signal for help, but they were too far from any traveled routes for smoke signals or emergency flares to be effective. "Let's get the others," Marcus said. "We'll pack light and start walking." They returned to the cabin to find Danny and Tommy waiting anxiously by the windows. "Truck won't start," Marcus announced without preamble. "We're walking out." "Walking?" Tommy looked dismayed. 8 miles through the soup? Fog's lifting. By the time we're ready to go, visibility should be even better. They spent the next hour packing essential supplies: water, emergency food, first aid kit, signal flares. Everything else they left behind, including most of their hunting gear. Speed and mobility were more important than comfort now. As they prepared to leave, Danny took one last look at the specimen vial containing the sample of fog. It was empty. The gray mist that had swirled inside it for hours had simply vanished, leaving behind only clear glass and questions that would probably never be answered. "Ready?" Marcus asked. They shouldered their packs and stepped outside together. The fog was definitely thinner now, visibility extending to maybe 100 feet in some directions. They could see the trail that would take them back to civilization, could make out landmarks they recognized from the hike-in. "Stay close," Kai said, taking the lead. "Single file, maintain voice contact at all times. If anyone sees or hears anything unusual, speak up immediately." They began the long walk home, made 4 friends who had entered the wilderness as hunters and were leaving as something else. survivors, witnesses to something that existed outside the boundaries of the rational world they thought they understood. The trail was exactly where they remembered it, clearly marked and easy to follow even in the reduced visibility. For the first time in 3 days, they felt like they were making progress, actually doing something to improve their situation rather than simply enduring it. But as they walked, they began to notice things that didn't quite fit. Small things at first. Trees that seemed to be in slightly different positions than they remembered, rocks that had moved a few feet from where they should be. Then larger discrepancies, trail markers that were missing, creek crossings that should have been there but weren't. "Are we on the right trail?" Tommy asked after they'd been walking for an hour. "I think so," Kai said, though he sounded uncertain for the first time since they'd known him. "This doesn't look right," Danny said, studying the terrain around them. "That ridge should be on our left, not our right." They stopped and consulted Marcus's GPS unit, but it showed their position as a blinking dot in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by blank space where detailed topographic information should have been. "GPS isn't working right," Marcus said, tapping the device. "Must be interference from the weather." But they all knew that wasn't a satisfactory explanation. GPS signals came from satellites 20,000 miles above the Earth's surface. Fog, even unnatural fog, shouldn't have been able to interfere with them. "We need to keep moving," Kai said. "Even if we're slightly off course, we're heading generally in the right direction. Sooner or later, we'll intersect a road or find a landmark we recognize." They continued walking, but their confidence was shaken. The fog seemed to be playing tricks with the landscape, making familiar terrain look alien and strange. Distances that should have taken minutes stretched into hours. Hills that should have been easy climbs became exhausting ordeals. And slowly, gradually, they began to realize that the fog wasn't lifting anymore. If anything, it was getting thicker again. "This is wrong," Danny said, stopping in the middle of the trail. "We should have reached the parking area by now. We've been walking for 3 hours." "Maybe we're going slower than we think," Marcus suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. "No," Kai said grimly. "We're not lost. We're being led." "Led where?" "Away. Away from the roads, away from help, away from anywhere we might find people who could interfere with whatever this thing wants to do to us." The truth of it hit them like a physical blow. They weren't escaping. They were being herded, guided along a path that felt like the right direction, but was actually leading them deeper into the wilderness, further from safety. "So what do we do?" Tommy asked. "We go back," Kai said. "Back to the cabin. At least there we know where we are." The decision felt like defeat, but it was also a relief. They turned around and began retracing their steps, following their own footprints in the soft earth. But even that simple task proved more difficult than it should have been. Their tracks seemed to fade and blur as they watched, becoming indistinct and hard to follow. By the time they reached what should have been the cabin clearing, they were lost again. The familiar landmarks were gone, replaced by terrain that looked similar but not identical. The creek ran in the wrong direction. The hills had different profiles. Even the trees seemed wrong, too tall, too thick, arranged in patterns that didn't match their memories. "Where's the cabin?" Tommy asked, his voice tight with panic. They spread out and searched the area, calling to each other through the fog, but found nothing that looked familiar. The cabin that had been their prison for 3 days had simply vanished, as if it had never existed at all. "This is impossible," Danny said, his scientific mind struggling to process what was happening. "Buildings don't just disappear." "Maybe we're in the wrong clearing," Marcus suggested. "There is no wrong clearing," Kai replied. "There's only one clearing within miles of here, and this isn't it." They huddled together in the center of what should have been their safe haven, 4 exhausted men facing the reality that they were completely lost in a landscape that was changing around them like something from a fever dream. "What does it want?" Tommy asked. "I don't know," Kai admitted, "but I don't think it's finished with us yet." As if summoned by his words, the voices began again. But now they weren't their own voices or the voices of loved ones. Now they were different voices, older voices, speaking in languages they didn't recognize. The fog thickened around them, reducing visibility to just a few feet, and in that gray prison they heard the sounds of other people, other hunters, other travelers, other victims who had found themselves trapped in the same nightmare. "Help us," whispered voices in the fog. "We've been waiting so long." "How many of you are there?" Danny called into the mist. "So many," came the reply. "Decades of us, lost in the gray, lost in the between." The realization hit them like ice water. They weren't the first. Others had been caught by this thing, this presence that lived in the fog and fed on confusion and fear. Others had been led in circles, stripped of hope and strength until they joined the chorus of voices calling from the mist. "We're not staying here," Marcus said firmly. "Whatever this thing is, whatever it wants, we're not giving it the satisfaction." "Where can we go?" Tommy asked. "We're lost." "Then we pick a direction and stick with it. No matter what we see, no matter what we hear, we keep walking in a straight line until we find something real." "What if we never do?" "Then we die trying." But we don't give up. We don't join those voices in the fog. They linked arms, forming a human chain that would keep them together no matter what happened. Kai took the lead, using his compass to maintain a straight bearing toward what he hoped was the east. They began walking one step at a time, through fog that seemed to resist their movement like thick water. The voices followed them, pleading, threatening, promising impossible things. The landscape shifted and changed around them, presenting false trails and familiar landmarks that led nowhere. But they kept walking, kept moving forward, refusing to be turned aside by illusions or fears. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time had no meaning in the gray-between world they'd entered. Their legs ached, their lungs burned from breathing the thick air, but they didn't stop. They couldn't stop. Stopping meant joining the voices, becoming part of the fog themselves. And then, impossibly, they saw light ahead. Real light. Sunlight filtering through normal fog, the kind that formed naturally over cool ground on warm mornings. They stumbled toward it like moths drawn to flame, hardly daring to believe it was real. The fog began to thin rapidly, revealing familiar terrain. The parking area where Marcus's truck waited, the chain that blocked the road, the sign warning about wilderness access. They were back where they'd started 4 days ago, as if the entire ordeal had been a fever dream. "The truck," Marcus said, hardly daring to hope. He climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine started immediately, purring to life as if it had never been dead at all. The fuel gauge showed full, the battery indicator was strong, and the radio crackled with the voices of people in the outside world. They loaded their gear in silence, afraid to speak, afraid that words might break the spell and send them back into the gray nightmare they'd escaped. The morning sun felt like a blessing on their faces, warm and real and gloriously normal. Marcus put the truck in gear and they began the long drive back to civilization, back to the world of mortgages and marriages and all the small compromises that had seemed so unbearable just 4 days ago. Now those ordinary concerns felt like treasures, like glimpses of a paradise they'd almost lost forever. The drive home should have been a celebration. 4 friends who had survived an ordeal that defied explanation, who had looked into something ancient and malevolent and lived to tell the tale. They should have been laughing, comparing stories, trying to make sense of what had happened to them. Instead, they drove in complete silence. It wasn't the comfortable silence of men who had said everything that needed saying. It was the heavy, oppressive silence of people who had seen something they couldn't discuss. Something that would sound insane if spoken aloud. Something that challenged the very foundations of the rational world they thought they understood. Marcus kept his eyes on the road, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. Every few minutes, he would glance in the rearview mirror, checking to make sure they weren't being followed. But followed by what? The fog was gone, the voices were silent, and the forest behind them looked perfectly normal in the bright morning sunlight. Tommy stared out the passenger window at the passing landscape, his mind trying to process 3 days that felt more like 3 months. Had it really happened? The rational part of his brain suggested it might have been some kind of mass hallucination, brought on by altitude sickness, or contaminated food, or the psychological pressure of being isolated in the wilderness. but he could still smell it. Faint but unmistakable, the odor of decay and rawness clung to his clothes, his hair, his skin. He tried washing his hands at a gas station rest stop, but the smell remained, like a stain that had soaked too deep to remove. In the back seat, Danny sat with his notebook open on his lap, trying to write down what had happened while the memories were still fresh. But every time he put pen to paper, the words seemed inadequate, childish, like a poor translation of an experience that had no equivalent in human language. How do you describe the sound of your own voice calling to you from outside a cabin? How do you explain fog that contained no measurable chemicals but carried the essence of nightmare? How do you catalog the voices of people who might have been dead for decades, all crying out from a gray-between world that existed somewhere outside the boundaries of reality? He tried anyway, filling page after page with careful observations and scientific speculation. But even as he wrote, he knew that no one would believe him. He barely believed it himself. Kai said nothing during the entire 3-hour drive. He sat in the corner of the back seat, his dark eyes fixed on something the others couldn't see. His mind replaying stories his grandfather had told him around campfires on the reservation. Stories he'd dismissed as folklore, as the superstitions of a people trying to make sense of a world that was larger and stranger than they could comprehend. Now he wondered if his grandfather's stories had been more than entertainment. Maybe they'd been warnings, passed down through generations of people who had learned that some things were better avoided than understood. They reached the outskirts of town as the sun was reaching its zenith, and the sight of suburban sprawl, strip malls and chain restaurants and housing developments, felt like emerging from a cave into daylight. This was civilization, the world of electric lights and paved roads and rational explanations for everything. The world where fog was just water vapor and voices belonged to real people, and the only monsters were the ones that lived in human hearts. Marcus pulled into the parking lot of a truck stop, the kind of place where hunters and fishermen gathered to share stories of the ones that got away. Under normal circumstances, this would have been where they began the long process of turning their experience into legend, embellishing details and adding dramatic flourishes until the truth became something that could be shared with people who hadn't been there. Instead, they sat in the parking lot with the engine running, none of them making any move to get out. "Well," Marcus said finally, his voice hoarse from 3 days of breathing foul air and 4 hours of silence. "Yeah," Tommy agreed, though Marcus hadn't actually said anything. "We should probably—" Danny began, then stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "Probably what?" Kai asked quietly. "Tell people what happened? Write a report for the Forest Service? Call the local newspaper?" They all knew how that would go. They were 4 middle-aged men who had disappeared into the wilderness for 4 days and come back with a story about supernatural fog and voices in the mist. At best, they'd be dismissed as attention seekers. At worst, they'd be committed for psychological evaluation. "Maybe we just—" Marcus paused, searching for the right words. "Maybe we just don't talk about it." "Ever?" Danny asked. "Ever." It felt like sacrilege, like a betrayal of the magnitude of what they'd experienced. They had looked into something that existed outside the boundaries of human knowledge, had survived an encounter with forces that science couldn't measure or explain. Shouldn't that be shared? Shouldn't the world know? But they also understood the weight of the silence that had settled over them. Some experiences were too large, too strange, too fundamentally threatening to the comfortable assumptions of daily life to be spoken aloud. Some truths were better kept secret, buried deep in the minds of the men who had lived them. "What happens in the deep woods stays in the deep woods," Tommy said quietly, invoking their old motto with new meaning. "What happens in the deep woods stays in the deep woods," the others echoed, and the pact was sealed. They drove to Danny's house first, then Tommy's, then Kai's, each man collecting his gear and disappearing into his normal life without ceremony or extended goodbyes. They would see each other again. They'd been friends for too long to let even this drive them apart. But something fundamental had changed between them. They shared a secret now that was too big for words, too strange for casual conversation. Marcus drove the last few miles to his house alone, the silence in the truck complete but no longer oppressive. It was the silence of men who had seen something together and agreed to carry the burden of that knowledge without complaint or explanation. He pulled into his driveway and sat for a moment, looking at his house with new eyes. It was a modest place, nothing fancy, but it had electric lights and running water and walls that kept the outside world outside. After 3 days in a cabin surrounded by supernatural fog, it looked like a palace. Inside, he went through the familiar routine of unpacking and sorting gear, but his movements were automatic, his mind still processing what had happened. He found the clothes he'd worn during their ordeal and carried them straight to the washing machine. But even as he loaded them in, he wondered if any amount of soap and hot water could remove the smell that seemed to have soaked into the very fibers. His answering machine was blinking with messages. Work calls, social invitations, the ordinary business of a life temporarily interrupted. But as he listened to the familiar voices of friends and colleagues, he found himself analyzing each word, each inflection, searching for the subtle wrongness that would indicate something else was speaking with their voices. The paranoia faded gradually over the following weeks, replaced by a kind of hypervigilance that never entirely disappeared. Marcus found himself checking weather reports obsessively, avoiding outdoor activities when fog was predicted, choosing vacation destinations based on their climate patterns rather than their attractions. Danny threw himself into his teaching with renewed intensity, as if educating young minds about the natural world could somehow balance the scales against the unnatural things he'd witnessed. But he also found himself editing his curriculum, removing references to unexplained phenomena, steering his students away from the kinds of questions that didn't have comfortable answers. Tommy's insurance business prospered, perhaps because his recent brush with inexplicable events had given him a new appreciation for the random disasters that could strike without warning. He sold more policies than ever before, but he also found himself writing exclusions for acts of nature with unusual specificity, as if he were trying to protect clients from things that had no names in standard insurance language. Kai returned to his work as a park ranger, but he began turning down assignments in remote areas, especially those that required overnight stays in locations without radio contact. His supervisors attributed his reluctance to advancing age, never suspecting that he was avoiding places where the boundary between the natural and supernatural might be thin enough to breach. They spoke occasionally, the four friends, but always about ordinary things: sports, work, family developments. Never about hunting. Never about their annual trip to the deep woods. Never about fog or voices or the smell of things that should have been buried long ago. The hunting cabin sat empty through the following season and the one after that. Marcus paid the property taxes and maintained the access road, but he never returned. Sometimes he thought about selling the place, but something always stopped him. Maybe it was sentiment for his grandfather's memory. Maybe it was the fear that new owners might not understand the warnings that previous owners had learned to respect. Or maybe it was the knowledge that some places were better left undisturbed, better left to the things that had claimed them as their own. That's the end of our story. Thank you so much for listening.